Hidden Crime Stories, The Ted Bundy Story, She Almost Made It Out. November 8, 1974, Salt Lake City, Utah. A shopping mall parking lot on a Friday evening, busy, bright, full of ordinary people doing ordinary things. Carol DaRonch was 18 years old. She was walking to her car when a man approached her. He was well-dressed, clean-cut, handsome in the easy, approachable way of someone you would not think twice about stopping to talk to. He told her he was a police officer. He said someone had tried to break into her car, that he needed her to come with him to file a report. He was calm, professional, completely convincing. So she went with him. She got into his Volkswagen Beetle because he was wearing a badge and speaking with authority and looked like someone she could trust. Because nothing about him, not his face, not his voice, not his demeanor, triggered a single alarm bell in her mind. Within minutes, he had snapped a handcuff onto her wrist. Carol DaRonch fought back with everything she had. She struggled. She screamed. She got the car door open while it was still moving and threw herself out onto the road and ran. She survived. She is one of the very few, because the man in that Volkswagen, the man with the badge and the calm voice and the face that looked like safety, was Theodore Robert Bundy. And in the years between 1973 and 1978, across 7 states, he had perfected the art of being exactly what his victims needed to see before they could question what they were feeling. Handsome, intelligent, and charming, Bundy became a rising star in Washington state politics en route to earning an undergraduate degree in psychology and enrolling in law school. He volunteered at a suicide prevention hotline. He was described by people who knew him, colleagues, girlfriends, professors, as warm, engaging, and completely trustworthy. He abducted, bludgeoned, and killed at least 30 women across a 4-year period in the 1970s, with dozens more also possibly meeting a gruesome end at his hands. And on Hidden Crime Stories, we are going to walk every step of this story. Not the Hollywood version. Not the version that turned Ted Bundy into a celebrity. The real version, told from the perspective of the women he targeted, the investigators who hunted him across 7 states, and the one woman in a parking lot in Salt Lake City who refused to become another name on his list. This is the story of the most dangerous lie Ted Bundy ever told. Not anything he said in a courtroom. Not any of the confessions he gave on death row. The lie was simpler than all of that. The lie was the face he showed the world every single day. Stay with me. Burlington, Vermont. November 24, 1946. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946 in Burlington, Vermont. His beginnings were complicated from the very first moment. He was born to an unmarried young woman at a time when that carried enormous social stigma, and for the early years of his life, he was raised, believing his mother was his sister and his grandparents were his parents. The truth of his origins, when it began to surface, planted something in him that he never fully resolved. A question about who he really was underneath the identity he had been given. He was a bright child, curious, quick. By the time he reached adolescence in Tacoma, Washington, where his mother had moved after marrying a man named Johnny Bundy, he was already developing the social skills that would define his adult life. He was engaging, likable, the kind of person who could walk into a room and make everyone in it feel noticed. But people who knew him well, who spent real time with him beyond the surface, described something that sits uneasily alongside that charm, a blankness underneath. A quality of performance to his warmth, as if he had studied how warmth was supposed to look and then reproduced it carefully, rather than feeling it genuinely. He excelled academically. He studied psychology at the University of Washington, a choice that, in retrospect, reads like a man who wanted to understand the machinery of human behavior well enough to manipulate it. He worked on a political campaign. He volunteered at a crisis hotline, where he spent hours talking distressed and vulnerable people through their worst moments. His supervisor at the crisis center later said, in one of the most chilling assessments ever given about a person, that Ted Bundy was one of the best volunteers she had ever worked with. That he had a genuine gift for connecting with people in crisis. That he made callers feel heard and safe. He understood vulnerability. He understood exactly what a person in distress needed to hear. And he used that understanding in ways his supervisor could never have imagined. He enrolled in law school. He had political ambitions. People who worked alongside him in Washington Republican Party circles spoke of him as someone going places, someone with a future. He had a long-term girlfriend named Liz Klupfer who described their relationship as warm, loving, and completely normal. She had no idea, nobody did, Because Ted Bundy had constructed his identity, his charming, educated, ambitious, trustworthy identity, with the same deliberate precision that a craftsman builds something meant to last. Every element of his public self served a purpose. Every relationship was a layer of protection. Every credential was armor. Underneath all of it, something had been building since his teenage years. Something dark and specific and completely hidden. And in 1973, it finally reached the surface. Seattle, Washington. The first confirmed killing attributed to Ted Bundy occurred in 1973, though investigators believe the timeline of his crimes may extend further back than what has been officially documented. What is known is that by 1974 he had found a rhythm, a methodology so carefully constructed that it would allow him to operate across multiple states for years before anyone connected the dots. He targeted young women, predominantly college students, intelligent, independent, trusting. He approached them in daylight, in public places, in the full view of other people. Sometimes he wore a fake cast on his arm and asked for help carrying something to his car. Sometimes he posed as an authority figure, a police officer, a firefighter, a campus official. Sometimes he simply approached with the easy confidence of someone who has never had trouble striking up a conversation with a stranger. He was, by every account of the women who survived encounters with him, utterly convincing. Not just plausible, convincing. The kind of convincing that makes you feel slightly embarrassed afterward for having any doubt at all. The Pacific Northwest disappeared women through 1974 in a pattern that investigators were slow to connect precisely because it violated their assumptions about how violence worked. These were not women who had taken obvious risks. They were not in dangerous places at dangerous hours. They were at campgrounds and university campuses and shopping malls in the middle of the afternoon. They were doing completely ordinary things when Ted Bundy appeared and offered them something that seemed completely reasonable. Linda Ann Healy, Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, Brenda Ball, Georgian Hawkins was all disappeared from Washington and Oregon in the first half of 1974. Then in July 1974, something happened at Lake Sammamish State Park in Washington that gave investigators their first real look at what they were dealing with. In a single afternoon, Bundy approached multiple women at the crowded park, in full view of hundreds of people, using his arm sling and his easy smile and his name, which he offered freely. He told them his name was Ted. Two women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, agreed to help him. Neither came home. The witnesses who later came forward described a handsome, charming man with his arm in a sling asking for help with his sailboat. They described him as completely unthreatening, as the kind of person you would not hesitate to help. Investigators now had a first name and a physical description. But Ted was a very common name, and the description, tall, brown hair, handsome, well-dressed, matched an enormous number of men in the Pacific Northwest. Bundy moved to Utah that fall. The killings continued. November 8, 1974, Salt Lake City, Utah. We have already met Carol DaRonch, the 18-year-old who threw herself out of a moving Volkswagen and ran. But what happened after her escape is what makes her story the turning point in everything. She went to the police. She gave a detailed description. She sat with a sketch artist. She described the fake badge, the handcuffs, the car, a Volkswagen Beetle, and the man who had presented himself as a police officer with such complete conviction that she had gotten in without hesitation. That same evening, in a town nearby, a high school student named Deborah Kent disappeared from a school play. She was never found. Carol DaRonch's report sat in an investigation file. The sketch existed, the description existed, but the connection to the disappearances in Washington and Oregon had not yet been made, because in 1974 cross-state information sharing in law, enforcement was slow, inconsistent, and largely dependent on individual investigators making personal calls to colleagues in other jurisdictions. Ted Bundy understood this fragmentation. He had studied criminal justice. He knew how investigations worked. He knew that a killer who crossed state lines was dramatically harder to catch than one who operated in a single area, because the pattern only becomes visible when someone is looking at all the pieces simultaneously. So he kept moving. Utah, Colorado, Idaho, always the Volkswagen, always the charm, always the daylight, always the public spaces where his approach looked completely innocent to everyone watching. In January 1975, Karen Campbell disappeared from a Colorado ski resort. In March, Melanie Cooley. In July, Shelley Robertson. And then, in August 1975, A police officer in a suburb of Salt Lake City ran the plates on a slowly cruising Volkswagen Beetle in the early morning hours and pulled the driver over for a routine check. Police arrested Bundy for the first time after pulling him over in his Volkswagen and finding suspicious items, including handcuffs, rope, and a ski mask that investigators later linked to missing women. He was calm during the stop, cooperative. He had an explanation for everything. The handcuffs were for sexual play, the rope was for his apartment, the ski mask was for skiing. None of it was provable as a lie in that moment, but investigators kept his name. And when Carol DaRonch was brought in for a lineup in October 1975, when she stood behind the glass and looked at the men lined up on the other side, she pointed without hesitation. That one. Carol DaRonch, one of Bundy's victims who had managed to escape, identified him in a lineup. Good morning, America, the man everyone had trusted, the law student, the political volunteer, the crisis hotline counselor, was Ted Bundy. Before we go any further, I need to stop for just a moment and ask you something. If this story is gripping you the way I believe it is right now, take 5 seconds and subscribe to Hidden Crime Stories. Every single week we bring you cases exactly like this one. Real, deeply researched, told the way the victims deserve to have their stories heard. Stories that stay with you. Stories that change the way you see the world. And what we have lined up in the coming weeks is something your true crime feed absolutely cannot miss. Subscribe right now, and let's get back to Ted Bundy, because what he did next, after the arrest, after the lineup, after Carol DaRonch pointed directly at him, is something that almost nobody was prepared for. Here is the thing about Ted Bundy that separates his case from almost every other story in true crime. He escaped twice, not metaphorically, not legally, physically, from custody, while facing murder charges. With investigators across some states building cases against him, he escaped twice and kept killing. Bundy was found guilty of aggravated kidnapping, drawing a 1 to 15-year prison sentence. He was convicted on the Carol DaRonch kidnapping charge in Utah, a significant result but far short of what investigators in multiple states believed he was responsible for. Colorado charged him with the murder of Karen Campbell and had him transferred to Aspen to stand trial. He was allowed access to the courthouse law library to research his own defense. Clearly not relishing yet another trial, Bundy began to make plans to escape. He decided that he would represent himself at trial and was granted library access to research his case. He managed to jump out of a window whilst on a library visit. He jumped from a second-story window, 25 feet above the ground, and disappeared into the Colorado mountains. He was free for 6 days before being recaptured. Back in custody, transferred to a different facility in Garfield County, he immediately began planning again. On December 30th, 1977, he staged another escape, this time using a hole in his cell's ceiling. His disappearance was not noted for some 15 hours. 15 hours. A 15-hour head start for one of the most wanted men in America. He drove to Florida. He was free, anonymous, completely off the radar of every investigator who had been hunting him across the Pacific Northwest and the Mountain West. He had a new city, a new identity, and he started killing again. January 15th, 1978, Tallahassee, Florida. The Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. In the early hours of the morning, Bundy entered the house and attacked 4 women. He killed Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. He injured 2 others. He left. He attacked another woman in a different location that same night. And then, on February 9th, 1978, 3 weeks after the sorority house, he abducted 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from her school in Lake City, Florida. She was a junior high school student who disappeared in the middle of the school day. She was 12 years old. She was his last victim. On February 15th, in a manner very similar to his 1975 arrest, Bundy was apprehended after a scuffle with a policeman when the Volkswagen Beetle he was driving was stopped for having stolen license plates. Bundy refused to give his name and resisted arrest. The officer was able to subdue Bundy after a struggle. Back at the police station, Bundy gave officers a stolen ID and said he was an FSU student. 2 days later, Bundy revealed his true identity to police officers. The hunt that had crossed 7 states and consumed the careers of dozens of investigators was over. Ted Bundy was in custody for the last time. The trials of Ted Bundy were unlike anything the American legal system had produced before, because Bundy, brilliant, calculating, incapable of surrendering the spotlight even now, chose to represent himself. He cross-examined witnesses. He made legal arguments. He addressed the jury directly. He turned the courtroom into a stage and himself into the main attraction. Reporters and spectators packed the galleries every day. Women wrote him fan letters. People described him as magnetic, even seated at the defense table facing death. It was the performance of his life, and he knew it. But the evidence was overwhelming. The overwhelming weight of evidence against Bundy led to his conviction. Bite mark evidence found on one of the Chi Omega victims was matched conclusively to Bundy's teeth. Forensic evidence that was relatively new at the time and proved devastating. Survivor testimony was direct and unshakable. Bundy was found guilty of the murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy and sentenced to death plus 196 years. In a second trial for the murder of Kimberly Leach, 12 years old, taken from her school in the middle of the day, he was again found guilty and again sentenced to death. Bundy then started a dizzying array of legal maneuvers which eventually landed before the U.S. Supreme Court but ultimately failed. On death row, he gave interviews. He cooperated with investigators, selectively, strategically, always on his own terms. He confessed to some murders. He helped identify some victims. He kept others secret, maintaining to the very end the one form of power he had left, the knowledge of what he had done and where. The night before his execution, he gave a final interview in which he blamed his crimes on pornography, a statement so self-serving and so disconnected from the reality of his carefully calculated predation that investigators and psychologists who had studied him for years responded with open contempt. The day and night before his Florida execution, Bundy confessed to 30 murders, but authorities suspect even that number is low and that there may be as many as 50 or more victims. On January 24, 1989, around 7 a.m., he was strapped into the electric chair. Outside the prison, a crowd had gathered. Some held signs. Some cheered when the announcement came. There was something both understandable and deeply uncomfortable about that crowd. The spectacle of justice, becoming its own kind of performance, which felt oddly appropriate for a man whose entire life had been one. Ted Bundy was 42 years old. He took the names of an unknown number of victims with him. Some of them have never been identified. Some of their families are still waiting for answers. As recently as 2026, investigators identified additional victims through advanced DNA testing, which means the full accounting of what Ted Bundy did is still, more than 3 decades after his death, not complete. That is the last thing he ever managed to take from the people he harmed. The certainty of a complete answer. Before I give you my final thoughts, I want to speak to you directly for just a moment. If you have watched this far, you are exactly the person this channel was built for. Someone who wants more than the headline. Someone who wants to understand. If this story moved you, and I know it did, please leave a comment right now. Tell me what you felt watching this. Tell me which moment in this story stopped you cold. Tell me what case you want us to cover next. Your comments shape this channel and tell YouTube that this story deserves to be seen by more people. And if someone in your life needs to hear a story like this one, please share this video with them tonight. One share changes who finds us. Now, here is what I need you to carry from everything we just walked through together. I want to say something about Carol DaRonch before I close. She was 18 years old in that parking lot. She made a completely reasonable decision based on completely reasonable information. A man with a badge and a calm voice and a face that looked like authority told her there was a problem with her car and that she needed to come with him. She went, and then something shifted, something she could feel before she could name it, and she fought back. She got the door open. She threw herself out of a moving car and ran. She survived. And then she did the other thing, the thing that is actually harder than surviving. She went to the police. She sat with the sketch artist. She described everything she could remember with every ounce of clarity she had. She showed up to the lineup and she pointed. She sat in a courtroom years later and testified. She turned her survival into something that mattered beyond herself. Carol DaRonch is the real center of this story, not Ted Bundy. Now, here is what I need you to understand about how a man like Ted Bundy operated. Because this is not ancient history. This is not a cautionary tale from a different era. The method he used, the precise, deliberate, psychologically sophisticated method of using charm and authority, and the assumption of safety to gain access to people who had every reason to trust him, is more relevant today than it has ever been. It was his intelligence and charm that enabled him to reel in his unsuspecting prey. He did not find his victims in dark, isolated places. He found them in public, in daylight. In busy parking lots and crowded campgrounds and university libraries. He found them precisely because those places felt safe, and he had calibrated his appearance to match that feeling of safety so completely that it functioned as a key. This is what predators, who are intelligent enough to study their own behavior, understand that most people don't. Safety is a feeling, and feelings can be manufactured. The badge Carol DaRonch saw was fake. The concern in Bundy's voice was performed. The entire interaction was engineered from the first word to produce one specific result: her compliance, her trust, her willingness to get in the car. So what do you do with that? In a world where you interact with strangers constantly, online, in person, in professional contexts, in the ordinary daily transactions of a normal life, how do you protect yourself from someone who has invested enormous intelligence and energy into appearing completely trustworthy? Here is what I believe honestly and completely. You verify rather than assume. When someone presents authority, a badge, a credential, a professional title, you have the right to verify it. A real police officer will never be offended by being asked for their badge number. A real official will never pressure you to make a decision immediately, without time to think or call someone. A real person with genuine, good intentions will never be threatened by your caution. The people who get angry when you ask for verification, who pressure you to act immediately, who use urgency and authority to short-circuit your judgment, are telling you something important about themselves. Listen to that. The second thing is about what Carol DaRonch described in the moment before she threw herself out of that car. She said something shifted. She felt something before she could name it, or explain it, or build a rational case for it, that told her she needed to get out right now. That feeling is not nothing. That feeling is your nervous system reading signals faster than your conscious mind can process them. It is pattern recognition operating below the level of language. It is, in the most literal neurological sense, your body trying to protect you. Bundy's victims who did not survive were not foolish. They were not careless. They were human beings operating in a world where we are taught that good manners mean trusting people at face value, and that suspicion without evidence is rude. But your instincts are evidence. Your discomfort is data. The feeling that something is wrong, even when everything looks right, is worth more than any performance of safety a stranger can put on for you. Trust it, name it, act on it. Carol DaRonch did. She threw herself out of a moving car into the dark and she ran. And she is still here to tell us about it. The women whose names we say when we talk about Ted Bundy's victims: Linda, Donna, Susan, Roberta, Brenda, Georgian, Janice, Denise, Karen, and all the others. They deserve more than to be entries in a list. They were people with lives and futures and specific, irreplaceable ways of being in the world. They deserve to grow old. We tell their stories so that the things that were done to them mean something beyond the horror of what happened. We tell their stories so that someone watching this video tonight trusts the feeling they cannot name. We tell their stories so that the next Carol DaRonch throws open the door. Pay attention, trust yourself, and never let a charming face substitute for the time it takes to know who someone actually is.